series was unlike any other in recent memory. The COVID-19 pandemic greatly disrupted both campaigns. Rallies were canceled, some primaries were postponed, and both parties had to reshape their convention to take into account the effects of the deadly virus. Our second panel today, COVID-19 and the 2020 election process, will address and examine different aspects of the campaigns as they went digital. Our panelists are Zach Moffitt, CEO of Targeted Victory, a digital-first agency built for the modern mobile age. He has assisted Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, as well as Republican Senators Susan Collins, Joni Ernst, and Mitch McConnell. Chuck Rocha, president and founder of Solidarity Strategies, an award-winning consulting firm that represents progressives. Rocha served as a senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign. Mindy Romero, founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the University of Southern California's Sol Price School of Public Policy. Her research seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation among youth and communities of color. Today, this panel will be moderated by Dallas attorney Jason Villalba, chairman of the board of directors and president of the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation. A former Republican Texas state legislator, he served on the State Select Committee on Redistricting. Welcome, panelists. Jason, the show is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for putting this together. The Baker Institute is one of the premier foundations in the country for this kind of political insight, and we're just graced today with your presence and with Dr. Jones and others who've been such an instrumental part of putting this together. Our panelists today are some of the premier experts in the country, and I will allow each of them to introduce themselves, but quickly, we've already heard about Zach and Chuck and Mindy, but what I can tell you as a person who watches this closely and as a person at a foundation myself that focuses on Texas Hispanics, these three voices that we'll hear from today truly have a perspective that is very interesting and will have some insight that we might not have heard on the talking head television shows. So I'm just grateful today to be in the presence of such wisdom, and I hope to ask good enough questions to justify the presence of these folks. So let's go ahead and start by introducing Zach. Zach has already had his introduction. I'd like Zach to talk a little bit about his work, and then also he's got a presentation that he wants to talk about. And Zach, thank you for your work over the years with the Republican candidates. I was with Mitt Romney way back in 2008 during the primary, and so I know what a yeoman's job that you did in that campaign. And I know Beth Myers is also a part of the committee that planned this event, and she is such an icon of Texas politics, and I know she's a dear friend to both of us. So Zach, with that, take it away, and I might interrupt here and there if there's reason to talk about any particular subject in greater depth.
Appreciate that. And just confirm that you can see everything on the screen with the slides is fine?
I can.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, everyone. I wanted to jump right in and kind of give a frame, because I think it's hard to see, without understanding the foundation of kind of political efforts, it's hard to get into where we went as a result of COVID. And I think it's important, the professionalization of politics has really occurred since 2008, when President Obama opted out of public funding, because what you've seen is this explosion in spending, mostly driven by low dollar activation at scale. And the reason it's important is because all this extra money in the system has always historically run to television, broadcast by the super PACs and the campaigns. And COVID changed that. You know, it pulled forward certain behavior, whether that's through Zoom, digital ads, and others, and limited others, especially to start with, others when they're looking at it, to look at what they would spend on if you're not going door to door or doing other activities. So it's really important to understand that there's almost $4 billion more that went into campaigns, and how it was spent had a huge impact. So just some of the campaigns we worked with in 2020, because I think it's good you can go and look at their stuff as examples for people who want to see afterwards. But what I really want to break on is kind of like the three truths that we found to be true. What we have found on campaigns, because there are so many resources, that what we've realized is attention is what has been broken. You have to be able to break through. And what does that look like? Some campaigns are very good at it. Some have been quite poor at it along the way. The traditional playbooks are dated. A lot of people are optimizing for the wrong outcomes. A lot of people are running the old campaigns, trying to solve something that's already been done before. And then the media climate is changing all around us, right? We're looking at how do we deal with it when the news is moving so quickly with Twitter, Snapchat, with Facebook, and everything else that you're dealing with. And how does one break through at the national level when there's so much, back and forth, and yet we realize that the future of communications and trust is local? What does that look like? So for us, it really comes down to content. You look at how the 30-second ad traditionally was played, and you can kind of see that ads have always kind of had this kind of like methodology to them. But what we're seeing now is that people's attention is breaking, that if you don't build something for under 15 seconds, you're not actually getting your message out to people. And so most campaigns they want their kind of the users to behave the way they want them to, not the way they really are. And as a result, millions, if not billions of dollars are spent communicating incorrectly to people. And so one of the things that we broke out for this is what we've seen during COVID is actually users understand ad length. If they see a 30-second, they bump out. You see this on the average 30-second, people are leaving after 6 seconds. On a 15, they're willing to stay for longer. So what that tells us is user behavior is telling us what things need to be done. And so many campaigns you saw took their television ad, their 30 seconds, and ran it online. And so it was almost just kind of like pouring gasoline on a fire of wasting dollars to see nothing happen. You also saw this cycle, a huge move towards activation in messaging. And so, the Biden campaign did a great job of this, the iwillvote.com being incorporated into so many of their ads, and actually ads built around that. Historically, ads have been much more persuasion and awareness-based. Now they're activation-based, and it's really increasing the amount of participation that we're seeing. What else happens when you drop the 30 seconds? This was just what we saw in our campaign. But when you take away your dependency on a 30-second, you can reduce costs and turnaround times, a lot more iteration of message, so you can do a lot more deployment. What we're seeing is the macro message stays the same, but we're changing a lot of the underpinnings, opening sequence, color scheme, lighting, sound. And what happens is that, and you make everything specific to the platform. Viewer fatigue drops, things go up. We've seen, and you just on some of the numbers on the final side when we're talking about the size and scale. I mean, we're talking over 4,000 motion files trafficked in the last 100 days. I mean, if you think about it from the lens of what has changed, you have to restructure campaigns entirely to be able to take advantage of this. And I just thought it'd be helpful for kind of the audience to understand, like, what does a winning Senate profile look like? Not who raised the most, but what does it kind of look like across the board? The average race is going to raise about 25 million. They're going to send over 30 million House emails. They're going to make over 600 graphics, collect all these emails. It just kind of shows you the size and scope of what's going on. And I thought it'd be interesting as well to also just look like, what does an organization have to be structured for, and the assets for just a single messaging campaigns. You see here, we have long form, short form, curated stories, still graphics. People just haven't quite grasped the explosion of content and what that means for approvals, when things need to be bilingual. It's just put such a huge strain on campaigns, and some are ready for it and others are not. And then finally, just kind of closing on some of the key learnings as we look at things that have changed. COVID is an inertia killer. Like, it changed so many of the things that people historically have always just said, this is the way it is. This cycle, we saw much more innovation coming from the bottom up. Historically, the presidentials had driven all the change. This time, for different reasons, all the innovations seem to be coming at the local level and working its way up, which is actually a very huge net positive for politics in the long run, because you're going to have all these new staff out there who have been at the forefront. But we haven't seen that before. It's always been the presidentials driving it. You saw much more success, and I think that's why at the state level, so many races that people thought would be one way turned out another, just because people were looking at the wrong inputs along the way. You look at content versus data. We've kind of overcorrected since 2004 that thinking everything has to be modeled and dated. But what we're really finding is we have all these people and nothing to say. And so content is taking a bigger role throughout all of this. We're also seeing the dollars being deployed differently. So as the pandemic hit, we had clients who moved all their voter registration to online. That was something that historically people would have just said that wasn't the right way to approach it. We saw a massive expansion of chase programs, whether it's through mail and phone, but also through peer-to-peer texting, through text messaging, and through digital advertising. And
Zach, this is Jason VL. I want to break in just quickly here to see if you can give us some insight into the ways that the parties approach this. I know that Republicans were still walking doors, whereas at least at the local level and what we saw in Texas, our friends on the Democrat side did not do much of that. Did that change the way that they approached some of this modeling and some of these approaches? I mean, to me, it seems like that was just a completely different way to approach the voter this cycle. What did you see at the macro level?
That's exactly what we saw. I mean, but it was also consistent. The hard part was the Democratic Party is that they were somewhat locked in by brand. So there was a messaging component to it as well as the execution component. And, walking door to door was consistent with Trump's message and what they were doing, and it would have been kind of inconsistent with the Biden campaign, and they were approaching it. So we saw that, and that's supercharged. And we do think that door to door had a significant impact on turnout on races and probably gave the Republicans a significant advantage this cycle. Obviously, something that I think the academics will dig more into, but there is no doubt that we feel collectively that this was a net positive in terms of outcomes this cycle.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You keep on. Your presentation's wonderful.
No, exactly. And so look, and I think that also a lot of people kind of realize that peer-to-peer, which is really, the ability for people to text each other, but at scale, and never before have people gone directly into people's text messaging programs. And that's really something that, has changed a lot when you factor that on top of campaigns now and the rise of Zoom within a campaign. I mean, the Biden campaign really successfully leveraged Zoom for fundraising. It was just something the Trump campaign and Trump specifically seemed to have no interest in. So to the same point we were talking about door to door, there's just these structural determinations that campaigns make that have massive impacts, whether it's on door knocks or fundraising along the way. The other 2 points that I kind of want to close with, because I think that, a lot of people think about elections, but this was a cycle where we saw for the first time that there were people who had more dollars and cents. I mean, everything about the horse racing, politics has become so much about like the Super Bowl. We got countdown clocks, everything's this versus this, and this draft pick versus this much money I raised. What we realize is it's not who raises the most. You need to raise enough to be able to run the campaign you need to be successful. And the amount of races that were, outraised 2-3 to 1 on the Democratic Party at the Senate level that ended up losing by 15 to 20 points. I'm hoping that in the future, that'll have a big impact of how people think about these races. I mean, dollars in is just one part as we think about how much activation is coming. And then the final thought I would leave people with is no matter how much people thought COVID pulled forward demand, no matter how many people were on Zoom, we are still underestimating in digital on both sides. The reality is until the spend is the equivalent of consumption, we're in a misalignment. And we're still buying. I mean, the Biden campaign, for all that it did, still spent 20% of its budget on digital, which is $60 million, but it's still, there's no argument in which mobile and desktop is 20% of your time. So these are some of these underlying truths that COVID exposed that's still interesting as we look for now and going forward. Thanks.
Well, a couple of questions, Zach. With the emergence of streaming television and the elimination of really television commercials, even on cable, is that going to be impactful? Is television dead, number one? And two, as streaming emerges and we're all moving to our different streaming sites without commercials, how does that play in digital strategy, particularly in light of what could happen with the Twitters and the Facebooks of the world now having a separate set of regulations that might go on top of them regarding political advertising?
Yeah, there's no world in which television is dead. I think it's just what's happened is it's decaying at a rate faster than people expect. We're buying the same TV ads to talk to the same amount of people again and again and missing huge parts of the population. But you could take that and expand it to also mail programs. I mean, how many, Texas is a good example of a state, California too, where campaigns know they have to have multilingual mailings and digital ads and creative going out. And yet other places are just kind of passing over entire groups because they don't fall into their models. They just think it's too much work. And so I think what we saw this cycle, when we were GCing races, we didn't make it about a turnout election. We felt like with Trump at the top, turnout was going to come from both sides. We did believe it was a messaging election. And so as a result, we were finding the various niches that we felt allowed us to talk to people that others may be missing. And the amount of people that we saw and we turned out and followed up with after who said we were the only people reaching out to the only campaign talking to them, we think had a significant impact. And I think it's why you see in certain races, people were able to run ahead of Trump in Republican districts because they were getting his voters and reaching out to others. And I think that's, again, it's not always going to work like that because of the presidential, but in this cycle, that was really one of the key insights we found that, television was decaying, but there's still ways to reach people, but you really had to understand your audiences and the platforms from which they were consuming information and leverage that to the best of your ability.
And I think the impact of digital strategy really made it known, and it created this divisiveness this divide between the national campaign and the state and local campaigns, right? I mean, you're able to pinpoint and target individual voters, and you captured those Republicans, but uptick it with Trump, obviously. If he's not doing something like that, then he misses those voters. Is that accurate, or is there a number of other factors that had come into play regarding that division?
Yeah, look, I think the challenge always for Team Trump was that they had to expand beyond the electorate they got last time. And then the challenge is they had to do it while also knowing the entire electorate was expanding, right? We just had 20 million more people vote this election, but the percentage of the electorate that was 18 to 25 stayed constant at 9.4%. So it's not like one age group overperformed. So really then it meant you had to find people from all different backgrounds and communicate to them. And I think that's one of the challenges with a national campaign, that you're spread into all these states, whereas when you're only running in one locale, you can go very deep and very rich into it. And I think that the campaigns that were successful were those who were able to execute against that.
That's a very good point. Zach, thank you for your insight. That's very helpful and very insightful, and it's good information for sure. Let's move on to Chuck Rocha. I'm sitting here with his book. I know that he has it behind him as well, but would love to hear Chuck's thoughts on COVID and its impact on this election cycle, but also would really like to spend some time talking about what happened with the Hispanic vote, not only around the country, but particularly in Texas and the RGV, and then also in Dade County in Miami. So I'll turn it over to Chuck and regale us, sir, with your insight.
Thank you, Jason. And it's an honor for me to be here. It's an honor to be on the phone, on the Zoom with a bunch of folks who kind of sound like me. It's always a pleasure when that happens. I grew up in East Texas. You should know that part of my story, which I think is very important, is I was born and raised in Tyler, Texas. I've been doing campaigns for 31 years. My first paid campaign job was for our late, great Governor Ann Richards, where I was her East Texas volunteer coordinator way back in the day. I am Latino. For those of you who can't see me, I know I sound like an old white man when I speak, but I am a brown guy, and I'm from East Texas, and I am a Mexican. My grandparents came from Guanajuato, Mexico, up through the valley, made their way to East Texas, and had a little homestead in Kemp, Texas, of all places. And that's how I got to Tyler, Texas. You know, I think that it's important for you to know that I'm not going to have a PowerPoint today. I know that just really makes a lot of you sad, but I come to politics not through the regular way of politics. And I just think that that's so important for everybody to know, because I never went to college a day in my life. I've been working on campaigns for a long time. I've seen and done a lot, but I tell people who I work for, I've also messed up a whole lot. And when you mess up a whole lot, you're apt not to try to mess up again. So what you've done is you put emotion back into campaigning, and that's what we've done. There's a lot of things I could argue with Zach about, or with Jason about one of our philosophies of what's wrong. When you say what's wrong, it's kind of like my mama did hair for a long time. It's kind of like asking her what's the perfect haircut. Some folks like long hair, some people like short hair. And if you're like me, you would just like some hair. So, you know, when you look at campaigns, I want you to know of where I came from in East Texas, of growing up in the labor movement and doing this work. The goal today is like, how did COVID affect this election? I've never seen anything like this election, from Donald Trump and his impact on the election to every time something happens in campaigns, it's always new. And there's always something different. It's kind of like the discussion that Zach and Jason was having about TV. We've continued to do TV the same way, and I'm going to get to that. But let me answer the question. There's three big things about what COVID did to affect this election. First, it took us off the doors, and it made us not canvass as Democrats. What's that mean is Democrats love to say we're grassroots. We love to be out in the grassroots. We love to be knocking on doors. And that's what makes us so much better than them rich white Republicans over there. But that's just not the case. Like, in all actuality, we do just as good or as good a job as any of the other parties. But what nobody wants to say is that it doesn't have a huge effect unless you're doing it at scale. What does that mean, Chuck? Well, what it means is that unless you can have millions of people volunteering to go knock on doors like in a presidential campaign, field operations normally only make up 1 or 2%. You may can move more than that, but the problem is just simple mathematics. And as a Mexican redneck, I would explain it in this way. If you knock on 100 doors, maybe 10 of them answer. The average is about 8 to 15% actually open the door. If they open the door, are they registered? Are they somebody in that household who ain't never even voted or just got out of prison and can't vote? Like, you have all of these parameters where you only end up talking to a little bitty bit of people. Is it the most persuasive? Absolutely. Is it the most powerful? Absolutely. Is it the most inefficient? Absolutely. I'm just telling you that it's an important part of the campaign, but it's not the only way to campaign. So that had some effect. In some of these tight congressional races where the Democrats lost by 6 votes in Iowa, In some of these close county races where we lost by a couple hundred votes, that's where they were missing that field operation because of COVID. Democrats stayed off the doors. The second big impact was the effect that it had on people of color and poor people in general. COVID just over affected brown and black communities because they have less access to healthcare. So Latinos were dying at 3 times the rate of white people. Black people were dying at 2.5 times the rate. Our children were 8 times as likely to catch COVID. So what that means is there's this undertow of anxiety in a community that you're trying to turn out. So that had a big effect on these elections. 2 of the biggest effects of COVID was the canvassing part, and the other is just the overall turmoil on the ground with the community, Latino community to be specific, where they were saying that they had to be essential workers working in poultry plants, working in service industry, and then literally risking their life. And then you have somebody like me or Zach calling them, sending them a digital commercial saying, hey, don't forget you need to vote. Hey, don't forget to register to vote. Hey, don't forget, I know your grandmama's sick and you're worried she got the COVID, but I need you to vote. Well, all of that's hard enough in its own terms. Imagine doing that when people are worried about dying. So what the other impact it had is lots more people voted early or voted by mail. And a lot more states opened up voting by mail. So you could be easier. Almost 3 times as many people participated in this election prior to the election that had ever voted before. So there was a new access and opening up more ways. States like Pennsylvania, where you used to could never even vote by mail, opened up where you could vote by mail, right? A lot of states, not Texas, but lots of states said that COVID was an excuse to actually ask for an absentee ballot, where in Texas, you had to have an excuse of you were sick or you were going out of town, real absentee ballots. So that was another big effect. And then there was the Zoom effect. And I know we're on a Zoom, and I mean no disrespect to Zoom. I don't want these Zoom people to be mad at me because I do so much work on Zoom. But Zoom ain't no way to run a campaign. And there was so many campaigns that thought that Zoom was going to be replace what they should be doing as working, as calling people and talking to people. Let's just have a Zoom with all the Latinos over down in San Antonio, and we will have checked the box of doing Latino outreach to leaders via Zoom. No, that don't work. And Zoom ain't no outreach to Latinos. You get the same 6 Latinos that show up at every Democratic meeting on that Zoom, who've been down there for 100 years, who can tell you about HB Gonzalez and tell you about all the folks, but that ain't a persuadable universe of Latinos that you should be trying to inspire. That ain't none of them showing up on Zoom to be a reason of why. I'm just checking my timer to make sure that that's a good reason why, or a strategy. Let me also say that
I want to ask a couple of questions about this right here before you move on to your next point, because I think it's really important, the point that you're making. And one that I've heard you make before is with respect to consultants that are hired at all levels, we're not seeing a level of Latino consultants that are advising people at these levels. And so tell me, other than yourself and a handful of others that are in this business, what's going on, and does that have an impact on the ability to reach Latinos in a meaningful way?
Jason, I take my hat off because you know that question was going to make me hot. And it makes me hot because I get so frustrated with my own party. And I'm a yellow dog Democrat going back to Ann Richards. Let me be clear. I may have worked for Bernie Sanders, but I've been a Democrat and worked for Democrats my whole life. And the thing that really aggravates me, other than these TV consultants who continue to run every one of our campaigns and run it the same way they did back in 1985, which is buying a bunch of TV, is that the representation of the hierarchy of the campaigns hasn't changed, because there's not a reflection point where Black or brown or Asian American staffers can break into the hierarchy of campaigns. So what I'm getting at here is, if you're somebody like me or Zach or somebody who gets to work at the highest level of campaigns, Democrat or Republican, there's just not a lot of Black or brown or Asian folks in a decision-making capacity that helps you run a more culturally competent campaign. 69% of every public school child in Texas is not white. Yet that every one of the Democratic consultants in Texas, 99%, are white people, white men or white women. I ain't got nothing against white people. My mama is white. I love white people. I'm talking about the reflection of the community in the campaigns. And we wonder why, Jason, to your point, the national pundits were blown away when the Rio Grande Valley overperformed for Donald Trump. Like I could have told them that all day long. For God's sakes, I got roosters on my shirt and I wear a cowboy hat. I could have told them that Mexicans in the Rio Grande Valley act differently than the hipsters in Dallas. It's just a fact. But if you've got the same white consultants who have been looking at the way that the numbers work, it still says Latino on the voter file. And it doesn't give a nuance of where you come from. Again, COVID is another big factor what happened in the Rio Grande Valley because the economy went, psst. They thought Donald Trump had the economy up here at one point. COVID hit, knocked it down. There's no Democratic messaging down there. When people talk about an economic populism message, I remind them, and it drives them crazy. I'm like, yeah, Donald Trump overperformed in the Valley and almost won all the precincts down there because he overperformed by 20 points. The same counties that Bernie Sanders carried in the primary. Because guess who was down there talking about jobs, economy, healthcare, putting your people back to work? What would it mean to make 15? I mean, at the end of the day, and let me end with this because I've went on long enough. At the end of the day, it gets real basic, and we've gotten way too cute +2 with this analytics and targeting and polling of people literally just want to vote for somebody who's going to help their life immediately. And they don't really care. There's a partisan Republican, partisan Democrats. But what are you going to do for me today? What are you going to do to help me? Are you going to get me a check? What are you going to do to help me afford to pay for college for my children? And we've gotten away from that. Until we get back to that, you're going to see less and less people participating, unless you have Donald Trump and you have massive turnout like we saw in this presidential.
You make that point at the very end, and you started with it. And politics in the end is a personal relationship with the community. That's what drives it. I know when I was running, the most impactful moment I could ever have would be at the front doors where I could talk to somebody about their life and what it was that they were looking for. And I agree with you that analytics and data are good and important, but I do think they're somewhat overvalued and at all levels, including at the presidential level. And Donald Trump, for whatever reason, was able to tap into something in the Rio Grande Valley that resonated in a way that we hadn't seen before from Republicans. So I think that was unique. What other, quickly before we go on to Mindy, what other takeaway did you take from what happened in the Rio Grande Valley and in Dade and in some places in Nevada and Arizona with Latinos? What message did Donald Trump have that Biden didn't have that worked? I mean, clearly Biden won overall, but the delta between his winning ratio or percentage and Trump's was lower than it was against Hillary in 2016. What was the driver behind that? What were the drivers behind that?
Is that Latinos and folks knew who he was, and they believed, whether falsely or truly, all depending on what side of the party you are, because he had such an audience and he was on TV every night or on MSNBC or the local news or Telemundo. He just consumed so much oxygen that people liked him. They knew him or they hated him, right? But he was, and below that, and then you had Biden, who spent more money than Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama talking to Latinos. So he did what he's supposed to in those states. But below that, it just exposed the weakness of these campaigns at every level, because the Democrats lost 10 congressional seats. And of those 10, 6 of them are in districts that are majority people of color. And you heard what I just said about the real niche I have around the diversity and inclusion piece, all run by white people, all white consultants in these districts that are predominantly Black, brown, and Asian Americans. So there's no investment in the community at that level. And what I mean by investment is not canvassing. Canvassing, yes, but TV, radio, mail, digital. We spend so much time hyper-focused on white persuadable women in the suburbs, and where we spend a pittance of that talking to Black and brown voters. Like if the Democrats want to come back, they go back to doing a multi-layered paid communication. They put some eye towards more direct, intentional organizing with diversity and inclusion in the hierarchy of campaigns. Then you have a culturally competent formula that will work if you go and talk to infrequent Latinos and newly registered Latinos. A Latino turns 18 in America every 30 seconds. So this is a potential for growth if you go have a conversation. The one thing I can guarantee you is that they're never going to vote for you if you don't go ask them or tell them why.
Well, I know some don't like the idiom sleeping giant, but there is no question in my mind that the sleeping giant of the Hispanic vote is wide awake in America and will make an impact. So thank you.
Thank you,
Chuck, for your insight. That's very helpful. Let's move on to Mindy Ramiro. She is going to talk, I think, a little bit about some of the polling in some other areas, but we'd love to hear, Mindy, from you on your thoughts on the campaigns and particularly how COVID may have impacted this election cycle.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Mindy Romero. I direct the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. And actually, I'm going to talk about mail ballots is what I was charged with talking about today.
My mistake. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. There's a lot to talk about, and certainly messaging is part of that. I'll focus a little bit more, well, definitely more on election officials and public education as a key component of a successful, rollout or expansion of vote by mail. Let me go ahead and just share my PowerPoint. Hopefully, should be able to see my screen. Is that correct, everyone? I think I see a nodding head. Okay, I always like to get confirmation.
I can see it.
Okay, great. Let me move images down here so I can see a little bit better. There we go. Okay, so let's start off mail ballots in the 2020 election. So the role of mail ballots, and really there were multiple roles, right? So first off, just recognizing, kind of getting everybody on the same page here, my first few slides, giving an overview of the use of vote by mail in the United States. So we've talked so much about vote by mail and already today a little bit about the expansion, but to understand that, of course, it was an ongoing voting method, right, prior to 2020, dating back to somewhat of a large scale to the Civil War and even prior to that in some isolated places in the United States. And certainly over the last 20 years, very much over the last 10 years, we've seen it become a frequently advocated for election reform by many that have seen it as not just an additional method of voting for folks that can't get to the ballot box, but a reform that could potentially expand access to the ballot box for more people, right? Not just making it convenient, but actually much of that conversation around making the electorate more representative. Or at least the hope that vote by mail could be a key reform in making the electorate more representative. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Of course, in 2020, in the general election, almost immediately, once the country went on lockdown, election officials in March, many still having their primaries ahead of them, but everyone immediately thinking about November, thinking that vote by mail or mail ballots, right, could be a safe voting option, potentially the only safe voting option. And none of us had a crystal ball. There was a deep concern that potentially it could be the safety net for the 2020 general election. Will we be able to put on an election? What will it look like in November? Will it be unsafe for voters? Will voters just be completely scared off going to the polls? It might be, right, the tool that we have. And of course, it's varied across the country, but often talked about by many election reforms advocates and election officials. And then, of course, it was something that was manipulated in 2020 in the general election for political gain. And I'm going to talk about that in a little while. In the end, bottom line, millions of additional mail ballots were cast. And I say here in a variety of ways to emphasize that they're not all mailed, of course, right? Many are, and it depends on what options voters have in a state, but many were dropped off at vote centers or polling places, were available at drop boxes or their elections offices. So, received by election officials in many different ways. Speaking of messaging, just briefly here, wanting to make sure that everyone recognizes that just the switch to vote by mail, or for some states, the increasing expansion around vote by mail, or the expansion of making it more accessible and easier to access vote by mail, required a huge public information campaign. Anytime you make a change or a tweak to your election system, you need to inform voters. That change is only as good as voters are aware of it. You want to make sure that you're not inadvertently creating any, confusion or distrust of the system. And in this election, of course, we had the fear of COVID as well, and people being understandably so, as I think was mentioned just a moment ago, for lack of a better word, distracted, right, deeply so by COVID. How are we going to get this information out so people can actually use these ballots, know how to use them appropriately, properly, and trust in that change? And this is aside from the campaigns. This is from election officials, from secretaries of state. I know here in California, immediately, at the end of March, the California Secretary of State called together a working group of academics and election officials and community groups and voter advocacy groups to talk about how to put on an election in November. And a huge component of that was how to message that, particularly for low propensity voters, infrequent voters, first-time voters, as we expected many first-time voters in this election. And we have to recognize that not only is election reform, you have to, again, inform voters about it. They have to know about it and trust it. This is the biggest, in a sense, election reform that we've seen in the United States, right, in terms of the expansion of this for many voters, first time. And voters are generally low information. Voters are living their lives. They're not like many of us, I assume, all of us that are on this Zoom call, getting information around changes to the election. Yes, they're going to get their sample ballot. Yes, they're going to get their voter guide. Many voters don't look through that voter guide or have time to look through that voter guide. And especially voters of color, first-time voters by definition, are information low. So that's again, always a challenge, but particularly so in this election. We already talked about, of course, communicating and connecting during COVID has been additionally challenging, certainly for campaigns and having to change their methods, but yes, even for election officials. And then, of course, there was all the misinformation, which I'll talk about later, that was promoted largely by the President Trump, but also by others as well, specifically aimed at undermining public confidence in vote by mail, and ultimately undermining the use of vote by mail, calling it fraud, right? Rampant with fraud and so forth. But again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then as a counter, let me
break in there, because I think that's an interesting point, and I know you're going to cover it in a moment. But did Trump or the Republican Party make a mistake by taking that path, right? So instead of really supporting this idea of early voting, they, made it sound like it was somehow dangerous and fraudulent. But my recollection from being, a candidate was my best voters were the ones that were filling out those ballots at home and sending them in. And so it always confused me as to why Republicans or why Trump was trying to limit mail-in balloting. I mean, A, was that a mistake? And B, was it a mistake that was born of this idea that Trump had to create this post-election chaos to support a fraud argument? And if so, boy, that seemed to backfire, right? I mean, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the backfire depends on how you look at it, right? Let me start with, do I think it was a mistake, period, in terms of impacting Republican votes? I'm a researcher, so I think I won't, know or feel comfortable fully until I see all the numbers and be able to see all the data and be able to do the analysis. But certainly there has been, right, a lot of conversation around that already. I think we'll see the Republican vote increased in some areas. We don't know, though, what the role of vote by mail or in-person voting kind of directly, how that can be directly linked to it. But I think, sure, when you have a bird in the hand, a voter that has voted already, just in terms of your resources, right? Outreaching, and I know I have campaign folks on the line here, but you can cross them off your list and you don't have to talk to them on election day. That alone, right, frees up your resources to target other voters. And then things, especially in a COVID world, things can go wrong on election day. Somebody can be sick, somebody can be fearful of COVID all of a sudden, especially as it was spiking towards election day. I think there were multiple purposes, though, for Donald Trump. I think that was clear. And a big one was to, certainly, it's quite obvious, set the stage for his kind of justification around his loss and being able to say that it was stolen. The red mirage and all the ballots, that came in that were counted later, right? That was actually, so him setting the stage and painting, vote by mail as something that was rampant with fraud and benefiting Democrats. I think the message certainly got to Republicans. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit in terms of how their patterns changed, voting in person more and Democrats voting by mail. So it worked in terms of he got the message out. But and it worked in terms of setting the stage, right, for his post-election challenges and probably long-term, right, narrative that he's going to carry with him. But I think it's for me at least, it's an open book until we do the analysis to see how it impacted actual turnout. Yeah. Okay, let me move on. And just briefly, new sources of information messaging. We certainly found this election, attempts to kind of counter this misinformation, news, beleaguered news organizations stepping up to put out messaging around vote by mail, that it's safe, how you use it, trying to counter all of that. National campaigns around just voting, period, how voting is important and we can trust our system. Some of that was corporate driven, which, that can be not necessarily seen as a positive, but still we saw a lot of folks getting involved in the trying to build voter trust that we typically don't see. And that's very interesting for me as a political sociologist to see NBA players leverage their relationships with the owners, right, to open up arenas as vote centers, to see corporations, send out information around voting, again, in ways that we don't normally see. So that was really interesting. Let me move on. So just really quickly, I mentioned that vote by mail, of course, is a form of an election, electoral reform. So just to kind of place that here, things like same-day voter registration, election day voter registration, online voter registration, pre-registration, early voting, vote by mail, all of these, including vote by mail, how the reforms are first designed, because we know there's a lot of difference in terms of accessibility around vote by mail, how easy it is to access that in a state. But actually how it's implemented matters for equitable access to voting, because you can have a reform like vote by mail, and the way that it's implemented doesn't actually open up access for everyone, or at least not equally for everyone. And that's something important to keep in mind, and something that we'll be learning about as so many states made shifts this election cycle. What actually were the repercussions of that in terms of creating potentially a more representative electorate or not? Why do we even need election reforms? Just a couple of slides. I just think it's important to put this into focus. There are significant disparities in voter engagement, right? We're talking about right now, so far this morning, about candidates and campaigns and winning races. But if we step back, what about just engagement, period, and turnout? So we know we're going to see, when all the votes are finally tabulated, and we're just about there, but the highest turnout that we've seen in decades in the United States. That is incredibly exciting to see the needle move like that in a big jump. We don't know until we do all the analysis, did we actually get a more representative electorate? Typically when we see really high turnout, it means we have a more representative electorate. And what do I mean by that? I mean that because of disparities in turnout, groups are voters of color, young people, lower income groups, right, are underrepresented in the electorate. And the pie of actual voters in any given election typically does not look like the rest of the population. The voting electorate, that pie of voters, is older, whiter, wealthier, better educated than the eligible voting population is. And that has real consequences for policy implications for quality of life in communities like the Latino community in Texas. And I should have said my dad's from Texas. So I can relate to the odd Texas twang.
It's not odd, it's cultural.
No, I mean, like, people thinking it's odd, for Chuck, people thinking it's odd. I can relate to that. My dad still has a bit of it after all these years. So really quickly, to show you some of just in 2016, because we don't have the final numbers for 2020 by race ethnicity. White, if you just look at white, eligible voter turnout of those that were adult citizens that could vote, 65% for white, non-Latino, and non-Hispanic, 47% for Latino, 49%, almost 50% for Asian American, Black, 60%. Significant gaps, right, by race ethnicity. So electoral reforms and potentially vote by mail, right, part of that conversation. And in 2020, as we're opening up access, are we opening up access to vote by mail in a way, again, that not only provided a safety net, but hopefully didn't disenfranchise anyone and actually addressed the equity representation question. And this is just a quick chart to show you all of those numbers I just showed you for 2016, how historically, going back about 35 years, the purple line is the total turnout, the blue line is white, non-Latino, non-Hispanic turnout. And you can see that blue line is way above the line for the turnout, for Black, Latino, Asian American. So turnout disparities in the United States are entrenched. High turnout elections, low turnout elections, midterm, presidential, this is for presidential. No matter what we're talking about, the turnout disparities are significant. And I can guarantee you, without even doing the analysis yet, in 2020, they will still be significant. We just hope that because turnout was so high that maybe those disparities lessened a little bit, because typically they do in low turnout, in high turnout years, but they will still be significant, meaning a large degree. Vote by mail. So prior to 2020, voting by mail, of course, varied by state, ranging from needing an excuse to access that absentee ballot. About a third of all states, that was the case. Then ranging, to the other side of things, states providing universal vote by mail, or a state like California, where in the 2016 general election, about 58% of all ballots cast were vote by mail. In the primary in 2020, about 78% of all ballots cast. So close to all vote by mail. And of course, in 2020, states like California and Nevada that are not actually universal vote by mail ended up mailing everybody a vote by mail that was registered, and other states kind of moving, to some degree, not all, and opening up access and making it easier to get a vote by mail ballot, either not needing an excuse or allowing COVID to be an excuse, that sort of thing. Prior to 2020, about a quarter of all US voters use vote by mail ballots. We know that is already much, much higher now. And I already mentioned the expansion. So something I want to mention here is, we're talking about mail ballots, but there's a recognition that going into this general election, maintaining a safe in-person voting option was absolutely critical, particularly for voters of color. So lots of research, my research in California, for instance, has identified that voter groups such as first-time voters, Latinos, young people, people of color, prefer often, or more likely to use in-person voting. I take the word prefer out, but they're more likely to use in-person voting. And it's often harder to reach them in those public information campaigns, again, to tell them about new methods, right? And you may have a voter, for instance, a voter with disabilities that needs to go to an in-person voting location and use that accessible voting machine. Somebody who is limited English proficient that needs to go in person to not only get translation, but also to get help and to ask questions. There are a variety of reasons, or maybe it's just because you always do, and even in COVID, you want to go and represent your community, or you want to go and model for your kids, or whatever it is. We knew going into this election that having as many as possible in-person voting options was absolutely critical, and it would play a huge role in that representation question and whether the electorate was representative, right? So don't expand vote by mail and limit in-person voting options. And that was a question mark. Even here in California early on, election officials, and certainly election officials across the country, were also facing a potential reduction in voting locations because locations that had agreed to be locations, or historically always had been locations, were pulling out because they were fearful of their place being used during COVID. And election officials were seriously looking at potentially limited locations. It was a challenge up until election day across the country. And then lastly, we know that rejection rates, so a vote by mail ballot has to be verified, part of why there isn't fraud, that has to be verified. And it's a little different in some states, but generally speaking, there's a signature verification. And rejection rates vary by voter group. So some groups and some geographies are more likely to get their ballot rejected than other groups. And that's part of the implementation process and the public education process. And just really quickly, this is just showing some of the change over time in the number of vote by mail ballots. And this also has early vote. This is from the EAC, Election Assistance Commission. But I will breeze through that for time. So again, 2020, we saw leading up to Election Day, these are numbers collected by Michael Madonna of the US Election Project, 101 million votes as of Tuesday morning. 65 million as of that point had been received or at least reported from election officials. Absolutely incredible. Of course, many more came in after that. California, we could receive them up to 17 days. Some states 9 days, some states 6 days, some states 3 days, some days not at all. Some states not at all, but if they were legally, according to state law, able to be accepted, we saw many more come in. All right, the role of mail ballots in the election. So back to that manipulation. That's why I've got it.
We may have to move on to Q&A if you have about a quick wrap up, and then I have one final question.
Yeah, actually, this is my last slide, so perfect.
Okay, great.
And we already covered some of it by your question earlier. So, so back to that manipulation. I just want to leave here, end here. So again, those claims of rampant fraud, and that it would, by the president and others, that the expansion of the mail ballot specifically was designed to benefit the Democratic Party. Researcher after researcher early on in this cycle came out to say, look, we know from much research in the field that there isn't a party advantage around vote by mail. But those messages from Donald Trump and others did work, and we started to see public opinion change, and then actually on election day, right, come to fruition in actuality, where patterns, Republicans were generally speaking, not all, but many were favoring in person, and Democrats were favoring vote by mail. That's quite striking, that sort of information, right, could have that huge of an effect, that type of campaign. But we saw generally a lot of confusion around, and a lot of potential distrust of the system itself. And all of this stress also on election officials, getting phone calls when they're trying to put on an election and plan for election in COVID, calls asking them about fraud, asking them, even voters that had been historically longtime vote by mail voters, we know anecdotally calling in and saying, hey, I don't know if I want to use vote by mail this year because I heard that it's fraud. So the real question now is, moving forward, what type of damage has been done around trust in our electoral system, around methods of voting? Certainly we need research. Of course, I'm going to put that there in my slide, but I'd love to talk more about that in the Q&A. I think we have done significant damage. We've seen that. And it's more than just around vote by mail specifically. It's around how our elections put on, and it's trust in what we're being told by our election officials in terms of valid, responsible, safe voting options. Thank you.
And that was part of my question, is in a post-COVID world where we're not facing the pandemic, do the parties embrace or abandon vote by mail? I mean, we know what Trump chose to do in this cycle, but what happens, 4 years down the road, 2 years down the road in the statewide elections, when, again, from a candidate's perspective, we know these are birds in the hand, and they're least expensive ways to get votes. And yet, you're right. I think there's some concern about the system. The real question is, what happens, going forward? That's obviously conjecture, but what are your thoughts?
What happens going forward with just voter trust, you mean?
Well, in voter trust and with mail ballots. I mean, we know mail ballots worked for Democrats this cycle. Mm-hmm. We know from research that they're safe and fraud-free, but because there's been some concern about whether or not, on some parties' beliefs that they're not safe, what do the parties do? I mean, this may be a question for Zach too. What would you advise a candidate to do regarding mail-in voting? I mean, focus on it, spend money on it, or abandon it completely?
Well, I'll let Zach talk to the campaigns. I'll just say, in terms of election officials and state legislatures that opened up access in many cases, right, to vote by mail or expanded it, I think there is going to be a question, right? Do we, because these were temporary laws or executive orders, what do we do going forward? And of course, at a state level, by and large, going into 2020 and even now, state Republican leaders and Democratic leaders trust vote by mail. They use vote by mail. They use it in their campaigns. They have historic precedent using it. So the problem is that the public, right, maybe I assume they were going to get a certain level of pressure by those that are angry, particularly if they feel that the president was cheated out of, in this election by vote by mail. There will be pressure to not, I think, to revisit that and to not continue vote by mail. And we'll have to just see going forward what, how much of that is in play, and what Republican officials do to attempt to counter it or not to attempt to counter it. Not attempt to counter it.
It's a fascinating question. So Zach, if you want to weigh in quickly on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think that the framing we have to be careful about, like counter versus not counter. I mean, I think that there are, within the Republican Party, there's like some systematic consistency applied. I think a lot of things that were pushed at the end, there's some arguments to be made that some of the rules were done kind of haphazard without a lot of thinking through. And so I think that that's fair. Let's put that aside. What do Republicans need to do in order to win? They need to embrace every single mechanism available to them to be successful. I mean, I ran voter turnout in Oregon in 2004 for Bush Cheney, all vote by mail, right? You get anyone who goes out west, you win by vote by mail, you win by early. I mean, I think there's a larger conversation that should be people voting 3 months before election day when all these new informations come in. Different conversation information, but it should be easy and accessible to vote at all times. I think Republicans believe that. I know I do, and we want to be successful. And I think you're going to see like I said before, the best campaigns we worked with this cycle had massive chase programs. Like, I think there's just a disconnect between the national message and others and how people were executing. And I think there's some inconsistencies potentially about how different states deal with it, but campaigns are amazingly good at finding ways to be successful. And I think that, that's how they'll be going forward.
We're moving into the question and answer period. And I want to stick with you, Zach. This came from a viewer. Can you talk a little bit about what the impact on local radio station ads for state elections in general and rural versus urban, and whether or not those kinds of radio station ads are still relevant, right? I mean, we've got fragmentation among the different radio stations, and you've got this rural urban divide. How does that play out from the digital standpoint and from your advertising standpoint?
Yeah, look, I think the challenge is, again, that, I think trust is local. And so I think there's a huge impact. The challenge is most of these stations want you to pay a huge premium to talk to people. And so there's always this balance, right? Like campaigns, there's the emotional part, but there's also the reality that these are resource allocation businesses, and it's all determining where the next dollar goes. And so for certain areas, if you have more votes that are in these areas and you can be successful, I think you can do quite a good job. I think radio needs to be run for very long periods of time and really reinforce the message. I don't think you run them in a silo. So I think that they're quite powerful. I think the challenge every campaign grapples with is, are they worth what we're paying on a, per 1,000 impressions or whatever like the medium is? And I think that it can't always just be a math problem. You have to look at it in the larger, we do lots of things on campaign that aren't always the most optimal KPI, but have a really larger point of view. And I think it's probably more important, I think as Chuck said, what you say on that than what you're buying. And I think a lot of campaigns invert the two. Everyone's very focused on data and process and doesn't seem to realize that message is about 80% of the issue and the data is about 20% of it. We've over-indexed the other way. And as a result, it's why I think people keep underestimating Trump. If nothing else, his message is distilled and consistent at scale and has given him kind of an advantage against many others to date.
That's a great point. Chuck, this one's for you. It's one that I am very interested in. It comes from a viewer, and they were talking about the different positions that Hispanics might take, one for Republican, one for Democrat, which direction they take. What are the three primary factors driving whether or not an individual of Latino heritage goes one way or the other? Obviously, there's a number of characteristics, but from your experience and the time that you've spent in the field, what are the top three that you think drive the direction of an individual into a certain party? Did we lose Chuck?
No, I'm here. Geographics, where they live, country of origin, and is somebody making an ask? And what I mean by that is country of origin. If you're Cuban, if you were born in Cuba, you were exiled out of Cuba, you've lived under a horrible dictatorship, you happen to be a lot more conservative and 80% registered as a Republican. In the opposite vein, if you're Puerto Rican, you understand the government function, you've been here, they're about 75, 80% vote Democratic. So some of it's done with where you live and where you're from. The point I want to make about making the ask, and this is what was brilliant about, and keep in mind, I am a left-wing liberal Democrat, and I'm going to say something brilliant that the Trump campaign did, is they spent money to go ask Latinos to vote for them and made the case, knowing they're not going to get the majority of Latinos to vote for them. But guess what? Not going Democrats' heads. They didn't need to get all of them. They were at least smart enough to go make the ask and make some compelling ads that, if you lie long enough about having a horse, eventually somebody will buy you a saddle. And that's what they were hoping for. Is they can lie all day long and say how great they are, in my opinion, for Latinos. And some of them bought a saddle for a fella who ain't got no horse. And that's fine. They were there making the case. Where Democrats, my party will say, don't worry about talking to them Latinos till right at the end. We just need a lot of turnout, to Zach's point, and we're going to win this thing. They're going to break our way by 70%. But if you continue to do that cycle after cycle, you continue to leave out a whole demographic of young Latinos who don't know who they are. And in Florida, for one example, there are 591,000 Latinos who have registered to vote since Donald Trump has been the president. That's 600,000. The majority of them registered as no party preference because they don't know who they belong to. 200,000 of them registered as Democrats, 100,000 of them registered as Republicans. But most of them registered as no party. That you're seeing that in every district all throughout Texas as well. All these young Latinos, because Democrats don't talk to them and they don't like Republicans, they're registering as no party, waiting for somebody to come tell them a compelling reason why they should be either one.
Did celebritization have anything to do with Trump's appeal in the Latino community? I mean, the fact is he's a rock star among his supporters, and he's reviled by the people that oppose him. But as I think Zach mentioned, he's on television. I mean, you mentioned this. He's on television every night, and he overwhelms the airwaves. Did that have an impact? I mean,
he had 1,000% name ID. Like, that has some impact. Was that everything? No. Are Latinos more entrepreneurial? Sure, we are. Do we aspire and are we an aspirational group of people? Yes, we are. Is the average age of a Latino in America 26? Yes, it is. So it's just all of these things combined with them not making the ask in certain states or underperforming or not running the greatest operation. It's not just one answer, but they did know him. The good thing is a lot of them did not like him, but then a lot more people got drawn to him. Again, he only needed to get another 2%, 3%, 5%, 6%. And because he was kind of a macho guy, let's break a few things. I don't have to be, this and that entitled. He really got in with Latino men around law and order. He got in with them about, being rich. We could all be rich. And I figured out this COVID thing. So it was smart strategically of going in and shaving off here, here, and here. And then in Miami-Dade running a 2-year round the clock, Democrats are all socialist campaign in Miami that after a while sank into where he could increase his numbers by 18%.
Well, I believe we're at the end of our time. I don't know if we go to 1:45 or 1:30, but I think it's 1:30 and we're over. So let me just end by thanking all of our speakers today. What a wonderful afternoon to spend some time with these great minds. And I learned a tremendous amount. I look forward to hearing some of the rest of the panels today. I know Mr. Carney from Texas is going to be on, and some other great speakers are going to be a part of what's happening around the country. So from the Baker Institute, thank you. Have a wonderful week, and we look forward to having great conversations going forward and onward. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, fellas. I appreciate it very much. And Chuck, I'm going to repurpose that comment about repeating so much that you have a horse that somebody gets you a saddle. That's a good one. Haven't heard that one before. We're going to resume the program tomorrow at 11 a.m. Central Time with a discussion between attorneys who represented the George W. Bush and Al Gore legal teams during the court fight to decide the 2020 election, and compare that with what's going on today. Then at 12:20 p.m. Central Time, the two co-chairs of this year's program, Stephanie Cutter and Beth Myers, will have a conversation moderated by Dana Bash, CNN's chief political correspondent. Should be another interesting day, but in the meantime, let me remind you to tell your friends and colleagues that they can register to watch this by going to www.bakerinstitute.org. That's www.bakerinstitute.org. Thank you so much. And once again, thanks to the panelists. It was a nice show.
Thank you all.
Thank you.